at the University of Wales. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're pretty much at critical mass. Thank you to everyone that was on time for this. This is excellent. So we are just over 2 months out from INC 5, what is meant to be the final negotiating session for the new Global Plastics Treaty. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to secure an ambitious, robust, and equitable treaty that is fit for purpose to end plastic pollution. I think everyone that's joining us today is probably well aware of the process that's been underway and the UNEA resolution language that kickstarted this process years ago, as well as the significant complexity that lies ahead for those in the negotiating room to make sure that we land, I think, what everyone is really expecting that we get out of this process. So what we want to talk about today is the role of data in securing this success that everyone's working towards. Data, and specifically starting to unpack what some of the plastics data will be required to deliver on that UNEA resolution. It hasn't really been discussed much in the negotiating rooms. However, the availability of this data will be absolutely central to the future success of the treaty and the global regime that it creates. So our presentations today are going to be really focused on bringing data to the forefront of everyone's mind as we head into this final sprint to South Korea at the end of the year. Parties will be under increasing pressure to agree what that final text is, the final structure of the mechanisms that are going to deliver on the design. And so we really want to explain and take the time to unpack the role of data on some of these key aspects of the treaty, reflecting back on sort of that initial UNEA resolution and what we're setting out to achieve. Provide some context, I think, on some of the challenges around the availability of data that most countries face, but also provide some ideas and steps that can be taken to ensure the treaty structure and core provisions likely to be agreed at INC 5 can really facilitate and encourage the comprehensive data on plastics that will really ensure a transparent, accountable, robust, and ambitious, but also equitable process that I think everyone is trying to achieve. Before we get going into the presentations themselves, just a couple of housekeeping things. We'll have time at the end of the presentations for Q&A. This will be through written questions, so just encourage everyone, you don't have to wait until the end. Please start putting your questions as our speakers are sort of going through the various elements into the Q&A box. We'll be compiling those as we go and then just running through and answering them as part of that session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my two colleagues that will be presenting today. I also just want to acknowledge the contributions of other team members that form part of our team here at the centre that very much are at the heart of this presentation and a lot of the thinking that went behind it, but won't be presenting as such. We have an amazing plastics economist, Helena Dickinson, and plastics data scientist, Bella Charlesworth, who may be jumping in on the Q&A portion today, so you may get to meet them. But our first presenter will be Jordan Gakutan, who's a senior research associate within the centre. He's got extensive research in using data for monitoring and managing plastic pollution. He's previously worked with UNEP to explore the connections between plastic data and statistical accounting frameworks following international standards. After Jordan, our second presenter will be Randika Jayasinghe, who is our plastics and waste specialist. Randika has over 14 years of experience in the waste management sector with really deep technical expertise and experience working in Sri Lanka, where she's based, on plastic management there. So I will hand over to Jordan to kick us off.
Perfect. Thanks, Eliza. So in terms of today, this first section will look at the data for the Global Plastics Treaty in terms of the challenge and then the status of global plastics data. And then I'll hand over to Randika, as Eliza said, to explore the data checklists and implications for INC5. And so let's just start off with a common foundation in terms of the UNEA resolution. What does it actually say? And so at the UNEA Assembly in March 2022, there was a resolution was adopted to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. And so it requested the executive director of UNEP to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee, or INC. And you'll hear INC a few times in this webinar. And that committee is responsible for developing the instrument. And so one of the key things in terms of the treaty scope is that the resolution called for a full life cycle of plastic. And just so that we can think about what are the components of this life cycle, we can organize it into the production and consumption, the use of the product, the generation of waste, and then the subsequent management of that waste, and then the release of plastics into the environment. So it's the flow from all the way from natural inputs into the economy, and then also leaving the economy as waste into the environment, also known as plastic pollution. And so this treaty, there's a potential inclusion, implementation, or action plans of many different measures. So we may have seen talk about production reduction targets, the increased use of recyclates or recycled materials. How do we implement these measures through funding? There's talk about product labeling, EPR, extended producer responsibility, all the way downstream as well. How do we monitor the pollution of plastic and better understand where it comes from and where it goes? And also supply chain transparency and reduce subsidies for plastics as well. So a lot of different things being discussed, but hopefully you can agree with me that data is really needed to measure and manage progress to anything that we agree upon. But at the moment, there's quite a minimal focus on data. So it's now approaching, as Eliza said, its 5th session, which is scheduled for the 25th of November to the 1st of December this year. And that will be in Busan in the Republic of Korea. And the focus is really on the treaty commitments and potential measures. But there's not that much focus yet on data. And without national data or the data systems, or the pathways to develop these systems over time, that will really impact any country's ability to establish realistic but yet ambitious goals for the reduction and improved management of plastics. It'll reduce the ability to monitor and evaluate progress towards these potential commitments. And it'll also reduce or hinder the effort to evaluate global progress and the collective achievements of the global community towards these goals. And finally, if you don't have a data system or national data in place, it'll be difficult to report on progress in a timely, representative, and coherent manner. And there's been quite a few calls now for robust data. So the requirements, so the SIDS, for example, small island developing states, have been calling for increased transparency, information exchange, and cooperation, especially with regards to data, baseline and sustainable levels of production and consumption, so a technical report to understand baselines, and also support for global harmonized standards in key areas. Also, the High Ambition Coalition, so HSC down here, has called for the need for reliable information through the plastics value chain and binding measures and provisions on transparency, labeling, monitoring, and reporting across the full life cycle. So there's been a few calls for compiling robust data to support action in the implementation of the potential measures for this treaty. And I want to bring to your attention a precautionary tale from the SDGs, particularly SDG 14. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted back in 2015, almost 10 years ago. And they had a really ambitious target of by 2025, which is next year, to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollutions of all kinds, including land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. And so there was an indicator for plastic debris density specifically, which was conceptually clear in 2020, with further guidance produced in 2021. But to date, few countries have reported on this indicator. So it's almost been a decade, and we still haven't seen a critical mass of countries reporting on plastic debris nationally. So what are the implications for not having robust data and data systems for the plastics treaty? Well, most countries have yet to assess the state of their data mapped to the life cycle that I mentioned earlier. And hopefully we're starting to think that national systems will be critical for treaty implementation. And it really begins with an understanding per country of the state of data and data infrastructure related to plastics and waste. So countries should consider ensuring that the current negotiations, the current mechanisms are in place to secure ambition and equity within the treaty so that it's flexible for countries with the capacity to collect and compile this data. And maybe some countries already thinking about this or have established systems, and we'll explore that in a moment. But also account for and be equitable to countries that will need a lot more support in compiling the data that are needed. And also ensuring a pathway exists to increase capacity and the finance needed to support this. And so what are the challenges when compiling data? So if few countries know their data availability, what are the challenges with regards to data and the data availability needed to report on treaty measures? Well, for plastics and environmental data particularly, but for plastics, data are fragmented. There's very few national data sets that are centralized within one body. They're usually fragmented across a variety of stakeholders. So for example, the trade statistics could be held within the customs office. Maybe academia has data on plastics within the environment, or potentially the environmental department as well. And then in terms of waste data at the municipality level, that could be held again by another institution. There's also a challenge with plastic-containing products. So it's quite difficult to track these plastics through the economy, and particularly finished goods and packaging. So what do I mean by this? Now take, for example, a water bottle. Maybe the statistics for that water bottle in terms of trade are reported in a monetary value or dollar value, and maybe not in weight. So the amount of weight of that good imported or exported. Or if we did have the weight value, how can we untangle how much was water and how much was the packaging, the plastic bottle? And now that was a fairly simplistic good, but think about a more complex item, such as, for example, an office chair. So many of us might be sitting on office chairs at the moment, and that is composed of metal, for example, those levers, but a lot of it will be composed of plastics. So the cover, the foam underneath that cover, the base might be hard plastic. So how do we start untangling how much plastic are in these more complex goods? Another challenge are the waste data. So most data concerning production and the treatment of plastics are based on modeled estimates. So in many cases, they're not direct measurements of the plastics entering landfill, for example, or going into recycling or incineration. They might be estimated. And there's also accounting for the informal waste management activities as well. And so there's quite a scarcity of data describing the informal waste sector. So again, how can we get the statistics we need to describe how much plastic is going into landfill, recycling, or energy recovery? And one thing that is particularly challenging is we don't really understand how much is going into the environment in terms of rate as well. So when I mean rate of release, how much is being released for a certain specific point or period in time? What are the pathways it takes to get there? What are the potential sectors responsible for that release? And so there are early efforts. So for example, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have an early estimate of the different flows of plastics, as you can see here. The different colors represent the confidence in the estimate. And you can see the dotted arrows show the release into the environment. So there's a lot of question marks in terms of how much is being lost from sectors into the environment. So this treaty, we can view it as an opportunity, a data opportunity, to really centralize the data that are available and identify gaps. So we need to measure and manage the plastic flows from production all the way to disposal across the full life cycle for the implementation of potential treaty measures. And so we need to bring everyone around the table, all the different stakeholders that might hold this data, to identify what we have. And so we could also, as a community, address data needs and identify gaps. And we can also start to consider developing standards to harmonize data, to centralize knowledge of plastics across that life cycle. So what's the state of plastic-focused accounts or data? So most OECD countries can identify their plastic wastes. So they are required to report on the total municipal waste generated, for example, and the treatment methods. And you could also split these statistics by hazardous materials or packaging components. And in general, for these countries, trade data for primary plastics and plastic wastes are available. But some countries are going even further and structuring their data into accounts. And accounts specifically guided by international standards. So in 2012, the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounting was developed, which gives us definitions and also concepts to measure specific flows in the economy and from the environment to the economy as well, in a way that we already do for economic accounts or national accounts, which are responsible for GDP. And accounting is quite beneficial because it helps drive knowledge sharing between countries. It builds country capacity in reporting on official statistics, particularly environmental statistics. And it helps measure the dependencies between the environment and the economy, or the economy, impacts of the economy back on to the environment. And so just to give you an example, these are the waste accounts from Australia in 2019. And this is for plastics specifically. So they estimated that 1.2 million tons came from households and 1.34 tons came from the aggregated amount across industrial sectors. And so that's 2.55 million tons of plastics produced in that year. And then they could estimate how much was going to landfill, recycling, and energy recovery. And other countries have produced accounts, waste accounts, some which have disaggregated or separated the specific plastic component in their waste account. So there are quite a few countries that have been supported by SCAP, UN SCAP, in the Asia Pacific region. And what they did was they really started with what they had and then iteratively expanded. So we have Mongolia, Nepal, India, Maldives, Vietnam, Samoa, and Fiji. You can note that Maldives, Samoa, and Fiji, we have some small island states compiling waste accounts in line with that standard, the SIA standard that I just mentioned. So let's look at Fiji specifically. They produced experimental studies between 2013 and 2016 for their wastes, and also conducted a later waste audit in 2021. In terms of plastics, there's imports and exports that could be found, the total waste generated, and total waste landfilled, with estimates for plastics. For Samoa, they also did waste accounts 2013-14 and 2015-16 reporting years. And they also had similar metrics, although these ones weren't split, but could not be split rather into the plastic component specifically. But this is just to show that countries can start with what they have and iteratively expand over time. And with support, such as UN SCAP support for these countries, waste accounts could be generated. So when we say plastic-specific accounts, we can take aspects of existing accounts that might exist within countries, and then produce a system which tracks plastic-related data across the life cycle. So we could have accounts specifically for production in the domestic sense, consumption by sector and household, the waste generation, and then its subsequent management and treatment, and also the pollution in terms of plastics within the environment. And across this is also imports and exports. So imagine having a modular structure where you can have different buckets, so to say, of accounts which you can incorporate plastics data. And also, hopefully, provide a robust foundation for a lot of the reporting that could be used for the plastics treaty. So we at the Center for Sustainable Development Reform have begun a process to look at which countries have plastic relevant data in an accounting format. So we have the Global Plastics and Waste Account Tracker, which will identify the countries with open access waste data relevant to the plastics treaty and monitor progress as countries gather, publish new data, or release new accounts. And so my three key messages for you today are that this treaty really provides an opportunity to bring stakeholders together and centralize that data needed, the plastics data needed, to report on progress or the state of plastics within a country. To do this, we need to describe the entire life cycle. And at the moment, that's fragmented across stakeholders or unavailable. So to understand what's there and how we can bring it together, we need to understand data availability. And finally, if we compile accounts with what we have, then we can produce a system to report on the plastics treaty and iteratively develop that over time to increase capacity and increase ambition over time. So thank you very much. And I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Randika.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Good morning, everyone. So let me introduce the plastic data checklist. So the plastic data checklist is designed to help countries identify what data they have, what they're missing, and where they need to improve their data collection and management practices in relation to plastics. And this is very much relevant in the context of the ongoing negotiations for the global plastic treaty, as it can help countries prepare for potential data requirements that may arise from the treaty. So countries can use this checklist to assess their data readiness for treaty implementation. It can help them understand where countries might need flexibility in terms of reporting requirements. I will talk about flexibility again later in the slides, and identify gaps in their data collection and management, and also prioritize areas for improvement in data practices. Next slide. So the structure of the plastic data checklist is we have designed it in a way that it lists all the key data categories, including a description of data types. And then there is the rationale for data collection. And we list potential data sources. This can be very much country specific, depending on what data is available for each country and what are the data collecting organizations or departments that's there. The potential data sources is very much country specific. And then we are using a traffic light system to assess the data availability. So data availability, depending on if country has access to all the data, then it would be a green light, a green color with comprehensive data collected at national level following a standardized methodology periodically. So that means the data is available. And then if they have limited data, data collected at a regional level or only collected from certain sectors, then it will be partially collected data in amber color. Next slide, please. And if the data is not available, then we have the red color for the data availability. And also in the data checklist, we look at the reliability of the data. This is very much related to the countries. They should evaluate how reliable their data are to be determined by the relevant experts and the country context. So if the data is collected directly from national statistics departments, there's a high reliability. And then if data collected from proxy statistics, such as monetary equivalency, then we can say that there's medium reliability. And material data computed by balancing corresponding inputs and outputs, then there is a low reliability. So based on the data availability and the reliability, we can go look at all these different data categories, and we can assess where we stand in terms of data checklist. Next slide. I am now going to go through the plastic life cycle. The plastic data checklist covers the full life cycle of plastics, from the extraction and conversion of chemicals to plastic, to production of products, and the consumption, to all the way to the end of life of the plastic when it becomes waste. So I'm going to use this plastic life cycle as a guidance to talk about the different data categories in the plastic data checklist. Next slide, please. So the first data in the data checklist is production. In production, we are looking at domestic primary plastic, that is primary plastics produced within a country. And this could actually provide a baseline for plastic material entering the economy. We are then looking at domestic plastic products, which are plastic products manufactured within the country. And this can help us understand the conversion of primary plastic into the product. So this is the first starting point, where we are looking at the primary plastic materials and also conversion of that primary plastics into products, and how much plastic products are actually manufactured within the economy. Next slide. Next in the data checklist is the consumption. We are looking at primary plastic consumed, the virgin primary plastic consumed, consumption of virgin primary plastic by various sectors within a country. If you look at the plastic life cycle, you can see that we can actually look at packaging, textiles. There are different sectors that primary plastics are consumed. So this is where we collect data on the consumption of virgin primary plastics by various sectors, and this provides insight into demand for new plastics. Then we are looking at plastic consumed, the recycled plastics that are used for different products within different sectors. This could be useful for assessing effectiveness of recycling programs and circular economy within the economy. Next slide, please. The next category in the plastic data checklist is the trade statistics. We are looking at import and export of primary plastics. Primary plastics that are imported to the country or exported from the country, and that indicates dependency on foreign raw materials and role in global supply chain. And same way, we are looking at the import and export of plastic products that are imported to the country and exported to the country to help us understand and track flows of plastic goods and demand for foreign-made products within the countries. Next in the data checklist is plastic waste. Now, when we look at plastic waste, it's the total amount of plastic waste generated within a country, and this helps us to understand the scale of plastic waste and planning waste management strategies when it comes to plastic waste management. Plastic waste treatment has different components within that. So the first one is once the plastic waste is generated, how much plastic waste actually collected for management. And then from the collected materials, how much plastic waste is recovered for recycling or even for upcycling. And then how much plastic waste are directed for waste to energy or co-processing. I have taken this as two different points because in co-processing, plastic can be taken as an alternative fuel or raw material. But essentially within the waste to energy bracket, how much plastic waste is used for energy recovery or co-processing. And then plastic waste incinerated, but without energy recovery. This data is also important within the plastic waste treatment data points. And then the last data point there is data category is plastic waste landfill. How much plastic waste that is disposed of in a landfill. Now, some of these data categories can be quite different when we look at the different country contexts and how they actually identify what is a waste landfill, how they define a waste landfill. In some countries, there are no real requirements to have like a sanitary landfill, but they call the final disposal site as a landfill. So these confusions, these areas we need to finalize before we actually implement or use this data checklist. Next slide. Then we look at, after the treatment, we look at plastic waste trade, how much plastic waste is imported into the country to understand the international flows of plastic waste, and how much plastic waste exported from the country to assess the country's role in global waste management and impact on international waste flows. Then one of the most important areas, environmental leakage, how much plastic is in the environment. So this will look at the plastic waste that ends up in the environment, including land, water bodies, and coastal areas, and assess environmental impact of plastic pollution and developing strategies. This is another data point: informal and other activities, informal waste collection and handling, plastic waste managed through informal sectors. This is a difficult area to collect data, but it's very important, especially in the global south, where there's an active informal sector working in the plastic waste management. So it provides insights into informal waste management activities. We are also looking at illegal waste handling, waste collection and handling. It can be through formal or informal activities, waste collected and disposed through illegal channels, and it provides insight into illegal waste activities. The final data category is source level activities. The plastic waste that's managed at the source through reuse, recycling, or similar activities, because this is important in a data checklist to understand the effectiveness of local waste reduction efforts. And then we are looking at mismanagement at the source, because in many countries in the global south, burning and burying, open dumping are still widely practiced. Now, it looks like there's a lot of data categories, data points that we need to collect. So if countries, if they have no data or they have only little data, we have to start focusing on collecting the critical data points. So we can look at plastic waste generated, plastic waste collected for management, import and export of plastic products, domestic production of plastic products, and plastic waste treatment methods, because these data points have data in many countries through waste statistics, customs data, or reports at the ministries. So we have to start from somewhere that is easy for us to approach the data collection. So these are the prioritization data points for countries that's with limited data, that they can actually start collecting the data using this data checklist. Next slide, please. Now, what are the implications for INC5? How can we use this data checklist, and how can we actually look at achieving the targets that we are going to discuss later this year in Busan? Next slide. It's very important to secure ambitious target through robust data and flexibility. So data is key for a robust and ambitious treaty to deliver on addressing the plastic pollution. And but at the same time, we have to make sure that there is flexibility for countries. Not all countries have access to all the data that they need. So yes, not to actually weaken the ambitious targets, but also at the same time have flexibility for countries to collect data and report the data. So in the draft text, there are when we look at the potential treaty provisions related to data, we can look at pathways for increasing ambitions, means of implementation, and also specific considerations for negotiation. Ensuring ambition is really important, as I mentioned earlier, so that we will not actually lose the target, the vision to end plastic pollution. If you look at the draft text, there are texts in relation to setting up national action plans and allowing for updates to enhance data collection and reporting. And this also include data elements included in the plan framework, and also reporting on progress, how governing bodies can evolve, can introduce reporting modalities, and also if they don't have the data, how we can actually climb through a tiered approach for increasing sophistication, how with the data that we have, how we can periodically improve and actually report the progress, and also effectiveness, evaluating the effectiveness through periodic reviews and data improvements. Next slide, please. So means of implementation focuses on financing, capacity building and technical assistance, and cooperation mechanism. So in financing, we have to look at including support of data collection and reporting in developing countries, linking different options given in the text to support the countries to meet treaty obligations, and the global south, global north, and also the countries that, irrespective of where they are, the countries that has collected data and the countries that lack data, to work together and to improve the data capacity of the countries that lack data. So this is really important for implementation through a cooperative mechanism. Specific considerations for INC 5 include explicit language on data support in means of implementation, incorporating data elements in national action plans, and as I mentioned earlier, looking at a tiered or phased approach for reporting requirements and establishing a technical expert group on data methodologies. Now, we have only 2 months until INC 5. So how can we actually use this data checklist? We can use the checklist to understand the data requirements because there's not much time. But during negotiations, this checklist can be a tool for discussing data-related issues and data-related issues for transparency in goal setting and reporting. And post negotiations, we can develop action plans to address data gaps and improve quality to align with the international standards and best practices. So starting from assessing the data to all the way to setting up national action plans. So what are the key takeaways for INC 5? Data will be central to building an enduring, ambitious, effective, and equitable global regime. Next, please. The final treaty text should recognize that countries are starting from different points and have different capabilities. Current data gaps should not be locked into the design of the treaty. There should be a direction of travel and improvement for transparency, reporting, and MRV requirements as data capacities increase. The final treaty text providing for the means of implementation, capacity building, finance, and tech transfer should ensure countries can access support and share lessons learned on building national data infrastructure to improve transparency over time. So these are the key takeaways for INC 5. Next slide, please. And to summarize the key message from this part of the presentation, comprehensive plastic data is very much important. It's crucial for effective treaty implementation, and the plastic data checklist can support countries to assess current data availability, identify gaps and priorities, and understand and prepare for treaty obligations. Thank you, and that's the end of our presentation. Now I invite Eliza to continue the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Randika. So we're going to pivot into Q&A now. So let me just find the questions. What are we going to kick off with? All right, I've got a question from I think someone in the Philippines. What role does the informal business sector, so I suppose considering sort of the waste pickers, small recyclers, play in plastic waste collection and recycling? And how can governments capture data from these informal actors? Randika, I think you covered this a little bit in your slides, so I'll turn this one over to you.
Informal waste activities are really important especially in the global south, but they are informal. They usually do not report their data to anyone, and some of the data, how much plastic that they collect, can be actually collected from the material recovery facilities, but not everything. One of the biggest challenges that we see with the informal sector is that sometimes they cannot demand, like when they go to a household or to a company to collect the materials. Sometimes they will only recycle a certain material, but they need to collect all the materials that's given to them. And with that, what happens is only a portion that actually goes to the MRV will get recorded in some way, but everything else can be, maybe like discarded or sometimes even burnt to reduce volumes and not, having all the materials collected in their facilities. So collecting data, yes, we have included this in the data checklist because this is really important for countries like Sri Lanka, even a country like India. These informal sectors are really active, and they play a very big role in the plastic recycling, plastic waste economy. So it's really important that we actually consider their inputs into the in the treaty negotiations, in the national policies. But we have to acknowledge that collecting the data is not going to be easy. It's a challenge that we need to address because their role in the plastic economy is important.
A little bit of a follow-up question for you on this, Randika, is where should countries start? I imagine this is probably pretty overwhelming if you're one of those countries that don't have one of those waste accounts or haven't started along that process. What's a really foundational step that countries can take in the short term?
In terms of data collection, I think I talked a little bit about that on priority data. There's a lot of different data categories, and definitely if we start to collect everything, we are going to get overwhelmed, and it's coming from different data sources. As Jordan explained, the data is with different parties, so we have to start with data that's available to us. So plastic waste generated through waste statistics, waste audits, these data are available to countries, so that's a good place to start. And we need to actually improve the capacity of the customs departments to record more and more data. Yes, there are challenges in terms of how we define the products. As Jordan explained, if it's a packaging material, how we actually identify that it has plastic and in what percentages, what components. So these are places that already record some data, but we need to start looking at the granular details and how we can actually extract data related to plastics from these existing data sources.
Thanks, Randika. I think this is another question for you, but Jordan, feel free to jump in on this one. Got a question on what would classify as a legal waste management activity?
Jordan?
Hi, everyone. In terms of illegal waste management activity, I think, Randika, this is more your wheelhouse. But one of the key ones would be the illegal trade. So in terms of waste that's being traded between countries, or at least illegally, and not having a final destination, being stuck at port, that would be classified as illegal waste activity. But I'll hand over to Randika for more of the specific activities. Thanks.
So that is why I mentioned very specifically in my presentation that illegal activities can be both formal and informal. I know that this is a very critical comment, but with my experience working in Sri Lanka, I have seen sometimes the let's take a company. They will hire a third party to actually dispose of their waste, and there are agreements and everything in place to dispose the waste responsibly. But what happens often is that these third party contractors, they will actually go and dump it somewhere else. This is illegal because it's not acceptable to or it's not in the regulations to dump waste in open places, but it's happening throughout. And unfortunately, sometimes even the formal entities like municipalities, when they do not have access to waste infrastructure, they will throw the waste into an open dump sites, and sometimes to reduce volumes, time to time, they will burn the waste. So these are, yes, in the formal system also, the illegal activities can happen, and that can actually contribute to pollution and a lot of problems. Like when we talk about illegal waste activities, sometimes waste crimes, we always think that it's from the informal sector. It's from the parties that are not formally providing the service. No, it can happen through the formal sectors as well as the informal sectors. As I mentioned earlier, informal sectors, they sometimes collect all the plastic materials that they have to collect in that area, but only a portion is actually recycled or recovered or upcycled. The remaining, they cannot return it back to the source. So then they will dump it or they will burn it. So illegal activities happen at different spaces, plus including the one that you mentioned, illegal trade.
Thanks, Sonika. This, again, might be a little bit connected or interesting to hear your reflections based on illegal activities as well, but a little bit of a broader question to start off with in terms of, and keen for your thoughts as well as Jordan. Do you think that the treaty should be mandating countries to publish plastics data? I suppose how far should we go in the transparency provisions? And if so, should we be mandating specific data in terms of being reported?
In terms of reporting the data, I think yes, countries should publish, and I think in the text also there is a text on plastic waste databases, national databases, but actually linking to a global database. So yes, I think it's really important that we understand what data, what are the plastic data that's produced by a country. This is going to be challenging because there are so many gray areas at the moment. And yes, it's a challenge, but we should not actually make it a point not to go ahead with all the ambitious targets. We have to make sure that we actually collect the data, and this data checklist is a good starting point for us to actually start thinking. I mean, it's not that we can use the data checklist to fill all the physical flows and collect all the quantitative data. It's not going to be easy or straightforward like that, but this is a good starting point for countries to actually think, okay, we have data in this area, we have the potential, the data sources are there. Yes, data is available, but not only to stop there, but to really think about whether the data quality is good, whether it's reliable, whether we can actually use this data for reporting. So this is a good starting point. And I think not only this we can even expand this data checklist, and that is something that we're actually working on, to look at the broader social, economic, and regulatory data points, because yes, the physical flows can be important to develop the plastic accounts, but other social, the broader data points can also be really supportive in terms of the national policy and national action plans.
Thanks, Randika. Jordan, what's your perspective on this question? Should we be mandating countries to publish plastics data? If we should, how would that actually be provided for?
Yeah, so it's a fine balance where you want enough of an obligation that you're requiring countries to report on plastics, but you don't want it, you want it to be flexible enough, like Randika was talking about, that we don't lose sight of the countries that don't have as much capacity to report on these plastic data. So we need that data to report and then increase our capacity, increase our ambition for these targets. And I gave an precautionary tale from the SDGs, where we didn't have this thinking early on. So a decade later, we don't have the data we really need to progress our understanding of marine pollution, specifically plastic pollution from that SDG target. So yes, we should have it within the treaty, but it being equitable, that the requirements reflect the capacity of different countries to report, and also carry it across everyone towards a common goal.
Fantastic. To this last point a little bit, how can countries support each other in this process? I think you've both highlighted that this is not something that can be done overnight, requires a lot of time, capacity, but there are countries that are a little further ahead. What are some of the ways that we can build in some of this cooperation, either into the treaty or into sort of the focus of implementation of the treaty?
I think I need to highlight this point. In my presentation, I actually refer to Global South and Global North, but the correct term, I would say, is countries with comprehensive data supporting each other. It can be even a country in the Global North that does not have all the data that's required. So countries with comprehensive data supporting other countries that do not have the data or have little data. They can provide technical assistance. They can share expertise in data collection methodologies and how they have analyzed the data. They can do knowledge transfers on facilitating access to best practices and lessons they have learned. Resource sharing, like supporting allocation of resources for capacity building and conducting training. And when it comes to capacity building, especially providing training programs for the local expertise. This is something our center is very actively involved when it comes to ocean accounts and next for plastic work. And also prioritizing the guidance, like assist the countries with little data to identify critical initial data points and how to go about collecting those data. I think those are the 5 points I can actually think of when I think about countries with capacity or with the data supporting the others.
Fantastic. Thanks, Randy. If possible, I'm going to throw to Helena and introduce her. She is our plastics economist, as I mentioned earlier. I'm going to ask specifically, Helena, if you can speak to the role of business in supporting these efforts. Are there any innovations that you're aware of being implemented by governments, I suppose, to really incentivize the private sector in joining in these efforts, in throwing their data into the mix, and how has that worked? And is that something being contemplated, I suppose, within the current treaty structure?
So I think the main goal here is EPR. So in the UK, we've got packaging EPRs coming in, and we've had EPR for electricals for a long time. EPR, whilst it's not an incentive, it's mandated. But it does mean that lots of businesses are getting more and more involved in publishing data. And actually, we found that lots of businesses have been quite interested, and they're really keen to get involved in like developing the EPR as a process, because obviously the more they're involved, the more they can shape what that system looks like. And also it protects their environmental credentials, which in turn obviously like protects their brand. So I think EPR is the key tool on the table here.
Thanks, Helena. Throwing it open again, another related question. How can we engage with communities and community organizations, NGOs and others, I suppose citizen science as well, who are currently collecting data? So I suppose this is getting at the point that we've all mentioned, which is that most of this data is not currently held by governments, but they have, may have to be the one that's doing most of the reporting. How can they engage other forms of groups collecting this data?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. And recognizing, I think we have Heidi Tate in the audience, who's the CEO of Tangaroa Blue, who we've worked with extensively. And we've shown that a lot of the data collected by citizen scientists could be used for official reporting of statistics. And this has already happened in Ghana, where they have a citizen science community that's collecting the data that they've been using to report on the SDGs, for example. And a very similar model could be taken here, where the data from these groups are vetted by an independent organization like a National Statistical Office or a government body, could look at that data, ensure it's fit for purpose and representative, and then be used to report on international commitments. So we can see how citizen groups could provide the data that's relevant to reporting on the plastics treaty. So it's very much possible. We just need the enabling factors so that the community comes together and that the government also, or any other organization, recognizes the value of these groups producing data and making it equitable when they're providing data as well.
Thanks, Jordan. All right, I've got a couple of questions now, sort of looking at the treaty. Someone sort of is talking about which clauses, I suppose, of the current draft text are most likely to be impacted or need to be amended or debated due to potential data issues. So I suppose really looking at INC 5 and which of those current provisions that I suppose should matter most from a data perspective. And second part to that question, what are strategies to ensure that a lack of data, sort of these challenges that we're talking about, won't dilute the ambition of the treaty? So how can we secure a really robust and ambitious treaty whilst acknowledging that we're starting from a very basic starting point in terms of data availability? How do we find that balance that I think both of you have mentioned as well? Jordan, I'm going to pick you for this one.
That's tough in terms of getting the data we need. When we're trying to figure out what the exact data we need for the treaty, we need to start with what we have and understand what we have per country. And so Randika's presentation on the data checklist is one of the vital starting points for this discussion in terms of almost like a quick readiness check for what's coming soon into the future. And then from there, we can identify the gaps and then build on those gaps. And I'll now just pass to Randika.
In the treaty, we talk about periodic assessments and monitoring of the progress of implementation of the instrument. And here we the text highlight that parties within their capabilities, they need to report the data, like establish programs and collaborate with competent organizations to assess and monitor emissions and releases of plastics into the environment. And in here, one of the key points is that it's really important to establish baseline information on the types and volumes of existing plastic pollution in the environment, and periodically collect data and information on the different types and levels of plastic pollution in the environment. So looking at when it comes to reporting, like what is the existing pollution that's there, and how can we actually collect information and data on reporting this the level of pollution, and also looking at the production of plastics and how we can actually reduce the production, or how we can actually talk about managing the levels of production. I'm not talking about banning plastic. It's not it's not what I'm talking about, but how we can actually manage the production levels and also the data on plastic pollution.
And just building on Randika's answer as well. So once you have that data and also the actions, well, one of the things that we need to see with this treaty is, and what Randika mentioned earlier about equity and flexibility, the need for flexibility across different capacities and contexts. So having a different requirement for countries that have that capacity already. So for example, I gave an example from Australia of waste accounts. So they have structured waste accounts. They have the ability to disaggregate those plastic statistics already. And that might not be present in other countries, especially small island developing states, for example. So we need to start thinking about how can we have a tiered approach to data and data reporting. Could it be that, and Randika's checklist has the low, medium, and high reliability. Perhaps we start on maybe low reliability data, but that is available, and then ratchet or increase our ambition, our capacity over time, so that we're improving our data year on year, and also our ambition and capacity to report on any potential commitments.
Thanks both. Somewhat similar, and let me know if you want me to answer this one. But a question is, what extent does the UN have power to enforce the recommendations of the treaty, or the provisions of the treaty, I suppose they mean?
Eliza, I think
Is it me question? Yeah. This one's an interesting one because I think it plays off what we've been discussing so well in terms of data. I mean, there, under international law, there is no real way to comply. There's no sanctions or process for sanctions for a country that doesn't comply, which is, I think, as we've seen in the evolution of agreements over the last 10 years or so, why transparency is so critical. And transparency is built on really data availability and requirements around common reporting standards and getting that information out into the public space, because then you have an opportunity to compare countries, to have civil society and other actors assess progress. You can enable that collective aggregation of progress against goals. So in essence, transparency is a tool to promote compliance. Countries want to comply with their obligations. It's not going to be the UN that sort of holds them to account, really. It's going to be these transparency processes. I think we've seen this in the Paris Agreement, which is based on a similar model that we may end up with for the Plastics Treaty, which is very robust reporting and transparency requirements to shed light on country progress. So again, this really comes back to why data is so important, and why encouraging a common approach to reporting, despite that everyone is starting from very different starting points, is going to be so important to ratcheting up that ambition over time that I think both Randika and Jordan have talked about. Another treaty-based question that I'll throw to you two is whether you think the scope of plastic data, particularly looking at the production stage, needs to be narrowed to align with the plastic products that are regulated, or I suppose likely to be regulated based on the current text under the treaty.
You mean the scope of data that needs to be narrowed with the plastic, to align with the plastic products that are regulated under the treaty? I think yes, in a way, that we have to look at the probably it's like from a starting point, what are the products that we can actually look into? Because in terms of the products and the primary plastics, there's a little bit of confusion and overlap at the moment, that there is a lot of gray area. So I think it's really important that we first identify the proper definitions for this before we actually looking at the different plastic products that can be regulated within the treaty, if I'm answered the question correctly. Jordan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Randika. And so I guess with the scope of the data, at the moment, the treaty isn't looking at polymers, for example, it's looking at plastics and plastic products specifically. And that would be extremely difficult for countries to report nationally anyway. Should we narrow the scope? I think it really depends on the capacity of the country. If they already have the capacity to report on more ambitious disaggregated data, so more specific classifications, then they should continue on doing that. But as a global community, we need to be reporting in a similar manner. So having the same classifications, the same standards, the same components organized into specific flows. And I think that'll be the crucial step for the reporting on the commitments. So I believe this is from WRI Indonesia, and I think they're doing some great work already on looking at how these flows can be measured at different scales, from the local scale all the way to the national scale as well with their plastics partnership. And so if you have classifications that are shared across different scales, that really helps with the reporting. So my thoughts would be standardization and harmonization are key, and also using the same classifications, both within country and hopefully across the global community. Thanks.
I think perhaps another plug for the checklist as a tool that perhaps couldn't be rolled out really comprehensively before INC 5, but at least as a little bit of a starting point in terms of all the data points and data sources that may be required for that really comprehensive view of the plastics life cycle, using that to understand where your country is currently as a way to really understand what that reporting requirement might be and what that will look like in terms of the scope of the plastics treaty, the reporting requirements that come out of that, and what those early capacity building efforts and national data collecting efforts are going to have to be over the next couple of years. So it's really using that checklist as a way to sort of make sure that you understand, what the impact of the scope of the treaty is going to be, the impact of the reporting treaty, and really tailoring your readiness priorities, I suppose, to that. All right, let me find the next question. All right, got a question from the perspective of a SIDS, I suppose. How can SIDS, small island developing states, get large corporations that are operating within their jurisdiction to make their data accessible? This is a really good one, actually. And perhaps we haven't touched on this enough about, and again, coming back to the data checklist, I suppose, the sources. So much of this data is not held by governments themselves. So the question asks, recognizing that these corporations may be unwilling to share their data, How do we deal with that, I suppose, within this system? I don't think the treaty can deal with that explicitly, but what are some of the strategies that could be used? Do we have any examples of this being addressed previously?
Let me try to explain that. To answer that, Sri Lanka is not a SID, but I'll take Sri Lanka as an example. So yes, large corporations are not willing to share all their data. And I think that's where extended producer responsibility plays a huge role. For example, if the countries have their extended producer responsibility policies in place that can actually encourage the corporations to share some of their data, some of the important key data in national databases. But then there are other issues as well, like taking Sri Lanka as an example. Sometimes corporations are not happy where the databases are, how the databases are set up and operated because of their the data sharing or other competitors having access to some of these data. So there are challenges even when the EPR policies are in place for sharing this data publicly. But I think this is something that's highlighted in the text, that extended producer responsibility policies are encouraged, and that the corporations are encouraged to share their data with the national governments in some way, at least not in terms of the public, in a public domain that everyone can access, but at least within the with the government entities, so that they can make informed decision. So extended producer responsibility can play a bigger role.
Fantastic. I think that we are almost at time, and I'm not sure that I can see any other questions. So I will, I think, end with one final question for you both, in terms of what would be your ideal outcome from INC5 to really secure data within the future regime. How can the treaty really help us solve some of these data gaps that, Jordan, I think you mentioned we're still experiencing in terms of the SDGs? How could be a driver for change?
So in the first instance, INC5, one of the key outcomes would be a treaty. That would be the first and foremost, but a treaty informed by realistic but ambitious goals. And as we already mentioned across this webinar, hopefully that's founded on data, and not just any data, but data that's centralized, has standardized classifications, and can really help measure in a way that is equitable to different countries. And so those key components I just mentioned, it'd be flexible and equitable, it'd be quantifiable in terms of having quantifiable targets and measuring towards those targets. And I mean, this was more of a stretch, but if we could have specific language in that treaty that looks at data and structured data, in addition to data systems, that would be ideal, at least in my opinion.
Totally agree with you, Jordan. I think at the end of the INC5, I hope that we can finalize the treaty, and that we can actually start working towards these ambitious goals from the start of next year. It's a big task, but I hope that countries can come together and finalize the treaty, and INC5 will be the last meeting, and that we'll have a finalized text towards the end of this year. And yes, it's ambitious, but I think plastic is a complex problem. It's a wicked problem when it comes to data. A lot of countries have data challenges, but we talked about how countries with the capacity can support the countries that has no data or little data. So if we actually work together, I think we can address some of the wicked problems along the plastic life cycle. So that is my hope for the INC5.
Thank you both so much. Balancing pragmatism with ambition. I like it. All right, we are almost at time. So a few next steps. I think there was also some questions around whether we're sending slides. So this webinar has been recorded. I think when you signed up and registered, you had the option of selecting into follow-up communication from us. If you ticked that box, you'll get the slides and a link to the recording after this. We will also be launching the checklist and a short user guide to step you through sort of the application of that checklist later today before our second regional webinar. So we'll also be sending a link to the checklist and additional sort of blog and insight material for that. So you'll get all of that if you ticked that box. If you didn't, please reach out to us via email. We can add you into our mailing list and send you all of those materials as well. I think Randika, you mentioned this. This is sort of the start of our engagement around this. We'll be having future webinars, and we're also working on a fairly detailed guide to really step countries through some of the national processes to put together more complete national inventories, and then sort of eventually working through to what a plastics account could look like, or splitting, plastics out of some of the waste accounts that already exist as really part of a package of support around improving readiness for treaty implementation, hoping that we do get a treaty out of INC 5, or if not INC 5 shortly thereafter. So I think stay tuned for that. Thank you again so much for spending your morning or afternoon with us. We are running a second webinar to capture people in the Northern Hemisphere largely later tonight, our time. Thank you again so much to Jordan and Randika for sharing their insights and expertise, and thank you to all the questions. And we will be likely in Busan, most of us, so reach out in advance if you're keen to collaborate on that. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.